In the grand halls of majestic palaces, where decorum reigns supreme and every portrait shines with a polished glow, one truth remains shrouded: the afflictions of dependency. Beyond the velvet drapes and regal figures lies a concealed narrative of obsessions, silenced, altered, and often denied. Whether it be the allure of opium, the allure of teacups, or the embrace of brandy during meetings, these dependencies lingered silently in the shadows. How does one maintain an unwavering public persona while their private world begins to disintegrate? What follows is an untold tale of 30 royals marked by the hidden vices they bore beneath their crowns. Welcome to 30 British royals with secret addiction. Before we embark on this journey, ensure you've subscribed, not just for more captivating enigmas, but because to unveil royal secrets, a little assistance is needed. And while you're joining us, tell us from where in the world you're tuning in. What's the time there? Midnight, noon, or something else entirely? Let's uncover who else is navigating the corridors of royal history alongside you tonight. King George IV, who reigned from 1762 to 1830, is often remembered as the extravagant Prince Regent, a monarch swathed in velvet, adorned with regal wigs, and celebrated for lavish feasts and ambitious architectural dreams. Yet, beneath this opulent facade lay a man slowly unraveling, ensnared by the suffocating grip of addiction. George's craving for the luxurious was matched only by his reliance on substances that offered fleeting elevation. Among these, alcohol and laudanum dominated. For those unfamiliar, laudanum was the Victorian remedy for a myriad of ailments: toothaches, despair, heartbreak, you name it. However, George was not a casual user. He consumed it with reckless abandon, blissfully unaware of the fine line dividing pleasure from pain relief. His affinity for alcohol was similarly excessive. Wine, brandy, punch, gin, and anything potent enough to dull his bodily suffering or moral qualms. His cellar was immense and required its own staff, hinting at an indulgence that transcended mere thirst. His extravagant feasts featured an array of dishes, not for nourishment's sake, but as part of his performance of excess. What makes King George IV's tale both gripping and tragic is not merely his addiction, but the elaborate charade he maintained behind a meticulously polished exterior. Official portraits presented a striking figure of royalty, projecting strength. In stark contrast, the reality was a figure burdened by obesity, unable to ascend stairs unaided. Court painters blurred the line between fact and fiction, while public appearances were orchestrated, shrouded in euphemisms about his health. A physician's private letter, later exposed, described his liver as sizably inflated, while his digestive health was anything but regal. What catalyzed his decline? Some attribute it to the psychological turmoil stemming from his fraught marriage to Caroline of Brunswick, a union more about political maneuvering than romance. Others highlight the death of his beloved daughter, Princess Charlotte, as a key moment in his descent. Yet, perhaps it was the grim reality of governing a crumbling empire while grappling with a body in rapid decay that truly burdened him. Palace insiders later revealed the chaos surrounding George's volatile moods and drug-induced episodes. Managing these was an everyday challenge. One aide noted episodes of furious outbursts followed by prolonged, anxious silence. In a futile effort to ease his discomfort, physicians fed him more tonics, creating a vicious cycle of dependency. The life of the Prince Regent resembled a perpetual hangover. Remarkably, the public remained largely oblivious, viewing George IV as a pillar of stability, tradition, and national pride, even as he staggered through the twilight of his reign. Upon his death, he was afforded the reverence due to a deity, with no acknowledgement of the medications, the bottles, or the hidden collapses behind the luxurious silk drapes. Thus, the myth of steadfast royalty persisted, pristine and imposing. Yet, The truth lingered ominously like smoke from a cigar, revealing that even kings are not impervious to their vices. Often, those who wear the most extravagant masks may conceal the most desperate souls underneath. Notably, even George's own son would one day wear charm and grace, while secretly shrouding himself in a haze of cigar smoke thick enough to engulf all of Buckingham. King Edward VII, who reigned from 1841 to 1910, was a master at using charm to overshadow his personal vices, quite the contrast to his great-grandfather, King George IV, who cloaked his addictions in finery. Edward, who spent 60 years as the Prince of Wales before finally taking the throne, found himself ensnared in a web of comfort and excess. With a fortune at his disposal and few obligations, his compulsions, gambling and tobacco, spiraled uncontrollably. Reports suggest Edward was an enthusiastic cigar smoker, indulging in up to 20 each day, often requiring them to be specially imported and stored to his liking. They were his constant companions, providing a sense of control in a chaotic royal landscape dominated by his mother, Queen Victoria, and her political sway. His gambling, however, was a different beast, far less predictable and often scandalous. Edward's notorious gambling habit led to staggering losses, most famously during a private baccarat game in 1890, which scandalized the British press and shattered the illusion of royal propriety. Despite these transgressions, his charisma and a touch of humor disarmed critics, transforming potential scandals into mere anecdotes. Behind the opulent facade, palace aides were often fraught with anxiety, fretting over public appearances marked by his smoky attire and the ever-present shadow of accumulating gambling debts. Yet, due to his stature as heir, confrontations regarding his behavior remained largely unvoiced. When Edward finally donned the crown in 1901, he was already 59, his health waning due to the toll of his addictions. He ruled for 9 brief years, yet retained the image of a connoisseur of both high society and low gaming tables. His vices, although seldom officially recognized, would later leak into memoirs and royal gossip without ever tarnishing his legend. Edward was not seen as one unraveling by vice. Rather, he was a figure who turned indulgence into a sophisticated art, free from the guilt that haunted the mightier rulers before him. This would soon shift with his son, George V, whose struggles with a quieter, more insidious form of addiction would bring a stark contrast to the royal legacy. As we delve deeper into this royal saga, don't forget to subscribe for the unfolding tales of palace secrets. Join the conversation and share where you are watching from. Is it morning coffee or a late-night ramble? Your thoughts matter. 3. King George V, 1865 to 1936. In contrast to his father, Edward II, who revelled in indulgence and lived on borrowed time, George V embodied a sense of duty through every puff of his cigarette. The monarchy, it seemed, thrived on a blend of nicotine and rigid royal etiquette. While Edward was known for his extravagant gambling and scandalous laughter, George adhered to a disciplined regimen, showcasing a stoicism that sometimes felt almost comical. Yet, beneath this austere facade lay an addiction as relentless as it was commonplace. George puffed on up to 20 cigarettes a day, not for leisure, but for survival. For him, the cigarette was more than a vice. It was a necessity, a tool to help endure the burdens of kingship amid a crumbling empire. In his private writings, the portrait of a man emerges who reached for a cigarette not to celebrate but to brave the endless demands of his role. Unlike the overt flamboyance of his father, George lived with an internalized dependency that was subdued yet deeply entrenched. Photographs capture him in that habitual stance, fingers poised for a cigarette even when none is present, as though his body had memorized the ritual before his mind caught up. His addiction was not lost on his physician or the staff around him, yet the public remained blissfully unaware, as the monarchy's public relations machine carefully groomed the image of a steadfast king. Amidst accolades praising his discipline and austere virtues, royal doctors secretly grappled with George's worsening health issues, exacerbated by his chronic bronchial ailments, a situation fueled by those ill-timed cigarette breaks. Even as illness repeatedly threatened him throughout the 1920s and 30s, the palace narrative remained steadfast, minimizing his ailments while he secretly clung to oxygen treatments and medications just to fulfill his royal duties. The mornings began with a ritualistic combination of tea, a smoke, and silence, his personal sacrament amidst a facade of control. Yet, George was far from in control. He presided over a disintegrating empire with a family fractured by revolution and a public weary of regal formality. His addiction was not a scandalous act of rebellion, but a silent collapse, just one more cigarette to navigate yet another meeting or public appearance, convincing everyone that all was well. His death in 1936 was officially attributed to respiratory complications, though the details were carefully edited. In an infamous final act, his doctor administered a last-minute injection of morphine and cocaine, not for salvation, but to ensure a dignified exit that aligned with the morning newspaper's deadlines. Even in death, the pretense was paramount, as the king who weathered 2 world wars and an imperial decline had to leave the stage with dignity, discreetly avoiding a cough. Though the monarchy never acknowledged his addiction, the signs were unmistakable: yellowed fingers, a raspy voice, weakened lungs. They told a different story. George V's legacy became entwined with that of duty and resilience, yet with each exhale, you could sense the heavy cost of his carefully crafted image. And while his habits were framed as methods for coping with stress, they would pass on to the famously anxious George VI, who inherited both the throne and a profound dependency on smoke and drink, born not just from lineage but from the echo of his father's silent struggles, culminating in an audible, trembling fate all its own. In the realm of reluctant royalty, George VI stands out, not for his triumphs, but for the staggering effort that defined his kingship. Revered as the unassuming hero of Britain's wartime era, he was the stuttering king who discovered his voice just in time to unite a nation. Yet, beneath this brave portrait lay a man plagued by anxiety, seeking solace in 2 steadfast allies: alcohol and cigarettes. For George, like his father before him, these were not mere vices, but essential comforts. From a young age, he existed as the overlooked spare, the second son who found himself overshadowed by his charismatic brother, Edward VIII. When Edward abdicated in 1936 for the love of Wallis Simpson, George was propelled into a role he never anticipated or perhaps desired. To cope with this unforeseen burden, he turned to rituals and routines, and increasingly relied on substances that softened the harshness of royal responsibilities. As George entered adulthood, his smoking habit blossomed into a daily routine, smoking over a pack of cigarettes by his 30s, doubling that amount by his 40s. His aides expertly curated his public persona, carefully hiding the ashtrays that accompanied him and the anxiety that often swirled around significant speeches. The photographs shared with the world were meticulously chosen to conceal the fatigue etched in his features, the pallor of his skin, and the weariness in his eyes during official occasions. For George VI, royalty became a stage where he remained an unwilling actor, always in the spotlight yet never feeling at ease. Then there was his drinking. Unlike his father, who partook in drink ceremonially, George VI drank in solitude, frequently, and more often than not, in silence. His drink of choice was gin, yet in any case, that lifeline was a tool to ease the stress before speeches and inspections, a liquid balm for the burdens of duty. His former staff recounted the king taking a stiff drink before public broadcasts, followed by an endless cycle of smoking as he recovered from his exertions. This wasn't about enjoyment, it was about endurance. As the years went by, Physicians became aware of his struggles, albeit cautiously, addressing them with euphemisms while his health steadily declined throughout the 1940s. Despite assurances of recovery and light duties, the reality was stark. He was silently crumbling under the crushing weight of expectation and his chosen solvents. In 1951, George underwent surgery for lung cancer, though the word cancer never crossed official lips. Partial lung removal was followed by a quick return to royal engagements, a scarf wrapped around his neck, aides nearby, maintaining a smile through relentless pain. That same year, he was seen at London's airport bidding farewell to his daughter, Elizabeth, who was leaving on a royal journey. It would be their final parting. In 1952, at the age of 56, he passed away in his sleep, a king worn down by conflict, anxiety, and years of self-soothing. The official declaration of his death cited coronary thrombosis, a term that delicately obscured a life marred by stress, smoke, and silence. The nation mourned the loss of a steady king, yet few understood the tremendous toll of that steadiness. He had taken on a throne he never sought, struggled with a voice that often failed him, and turned to two quiet dependencies to navigate the painful divide between duty and self. And in death, as in life, his royal dignity remained unbroken. Yet, the next in line was destined to rewrite the narrative, indulging in cocktails not just in the quiet of the palace, but transforming afternoon gin into a daily ritual that blurred the delicate line between aristocratic ease and subdued dependence. 5. Queen Elizabeth, the Queen Mother, a figure who graced the world from 1900 to 2002. Known affectionately as the Queen Mum, she stood as the enduring face of the monarchy, a lady adorned with pearls that matched her unshakable poise and a handbag that carried an air of decorum. To the public, she epitomized British strength, the steadfast woman who remained in London during the Blitz, casting waves from palace windows with a porcelain-like serenity, and who outlived nearly all her contemporaries with an almost otherworldly smile. Yet, beneath the charm and gracious demeanor lay a hidden truth rarely broached in society's finer circles. She engaged in drinking, not in a scandalous manner, but sufficiently enough that those around her began to see it as routine rather than habit. Her drink was a special blend of gin and Dubonnet, equal parts, garnished with 2 slices of lemon, rind included. Prepared by palace staff multiple times daily, it often appeared before lunchtime and continued through the afternoon into evening. This account wasn't the tale of a wild reveller. Rather, it painted a nuanced picture of British aristocracy's discreet dance with drink, elegant, refined, and never acknowledged publicly. This silence was significant, woven seamlessly into the fabric of her formidable spirit. Her fondness for alcohol was softened under the guise of affectionate euphemism, a little something to keep her going. Even biographers during her lifetime tread lightly around the subject, wary of disturbing the national calm. Yet, former palace insiders spoke a different narrative. In careful conversations post-retirement, they revealed that her days were patterned by alcohol similarly to how others schedule their tea breaks. One footman recounted, the drinks tray arrived as regularly as the dog's schedule. An attendant later reiterated, anonymously, that the palace moved with ritual, cocktails being one essential fixture. Still, no one labeled her as out of control. That was never the issue. Her relationship with alcohol was measured, subdued, and in its own way, indispensable. It was not a case of excess but rather a tale of endurance. Through 2 world wars, her husband's death, abdications, and the monarchy's near collapse, she maintained the facade, hats perfectly positioned, smiles unwavering, and if a few glasses of fortified wine before dinner were necessary to uphold that image, it was entirely her affair, and notably, none of anybody else's. What's particularly intriguing, and perhaps disconcerting, is how normalized this dependence became. It attracted no scandal or concern. The narrative spun by the royal myth machine had already rendered her untouchable. The Queen Mother, the final empress, the beloved national grandmother. In that context, Jin morphed from an alleviating substance into merely a facet of her character. However, the habit was real, and it exerted a measured influence on her daily life. While her public persona remained pristine, her daughter, Princess Margaret, would not enjoy such protective obscurity. Where the Queen Mother's fondness lingered in an aura of nostalgia, Margaret's would unravel into tales of scandal, smoke, and the slow collapse of a woman striving to escape her own storied legacy. 6. Enter Princess Margaret, born in 1930 and departing this world in 2002. If the Queen Mother glided through royal existence with an air of poise and decorum, Princess Margaret burst onto the scene, martini in hand and a cigarette dangling from the other. This was the narrative spun by tabloids, carving out an image of a woman who embodied everything her sister, Queen Elizabeth II, was not. Daring, glamorous, emotional, and impulsive, Margaret lived in stark contrast to her sister's composed demeanor. Yet, beneath the glitzy surface of royal tiaras and sun-soaked retreats, lay a woman profoundly affected by the gilded cage surrounding her. Her struggles with alcohol, cigarettes, prescription medications, and perhaps most critically, the insatiable need for attention, started as tolerated quirks before spiraling into a heartbreaking reality. As the younger sister, she occupied the role of spare, a title that seemed to evoke a blend of resentment and enjoyment. Her formative years echoed within the lavish world crafted for her sister, knowing she could never wear the crown, yet always remaining beholden to her royal identity. With charisma as her armor, she flaunted public displays of smoking, danced joyously in nightclubs, and painted her nails red at a time when such defiance was revolutionary, all while showing up to formal functions as if fresh from the pages of a fashion magazine. Her allure was undeniable, yet it came with harsh expectations, a constant demand to dazzle and face the unyielding scrutiny when she stumbled. Margaret's relationship with alcohol didn't ignite amid scandal. Rather, it was rooted in daily rituals. Like many royals of the past, her day revolved around a timetable of drinks, a whiskey before lunch, wine during meals, and a port or brandy afterward. Over the years, this routine solidified, taking command of her life. Friends and former aides would later recount how the sharpness of her wit dulled as the hours passed, eventually giving way to slurred speech, frosty moods, and heavy silences. What once represented the vivacious spirit of Margaret metamorphosed into an increasingly tragic persona. Margaret, gradually retreating within herself. Her chain-smoking, relentless and fierce, reportedly reached up to 60 cigarettes daily for decades. With the mounting pressures of her royal engagement or in the quieter moments post-celebration, prescription pills surfaced to dull the highs and mask the lows. Tranquilizers, sedatives, sleeping aids, all legally obtained, all part of the swirling silver platter she presented to the world. The palace, meanwhile, was intent on maintaining an image. For years, her drinking was dismissed as mere eccentricity, her smoking viewed as a quirk of her generation. The public delighted in her laughter, her extravagant getaways, her daring romances. Yet, behind the veil of glitz were the private implosions, neglected appointments, and mornings spent hidden behind drawn curtains. Even following a series of strokes in the 1990s, discourse around her health remained genteel, focusing on health complications and mobility issues, while ignoring the deeply rooted physical decline that had become impossible to overlook. When Margaret passed away in 2002 at the age of 71, still younger than many of her royal peers, she appeared undeniably frail. The rebellious sparkle that once defined her had long since dimmed. Her complex legacy persists, illustrating the life of a woman both chained and characterized by her royal position, flickering brightly but ultimately fading into solitude. Yet, her saga is not an isolated one. Nearly 4 centuries earlier, another royal, far more formidable and daunting, had similarly succumbed to a life of compulsive indulgence. No cocktails or tabloid headlines for him, but rather overflowing banquets and early opiates, intertwined in a grand tale of royalty that made his tragic decline all the more grotesque. 7. King Henry VIII, who reigned from 1491 to 1547, lived in a time before the glossy facades of modern royal protocol. Long before Buckingham Palace cultivated crisis management and the House of Windsor maneuvered through public relations, there stood Henry VIII, a king whose immense power rendered the truth optional, if not irrelevant. Infamous across England, he was a force of nature characterized by a string of 6 wives, an unquenchable thirst for dominance, and a waistline that swelled alongside his sovereignty. In public, Henry embodied strength and vigor, yet behind closed doors, his health was deteriorating, propped up by compulsive feasting, copious amounts of wine, and early forms of pain relief that resemble today's narcotic usage. Once the epitome of athleticism and charm, a Renaissance ideal, he had become, by middle age, a figure of grotesque obesity and immobility. His existence now marred by chronic illnesses, ulcers, insomnia, gout, his mood swings turned the vibrant court into a perilous place where every interaction was a gamble. To combat his pain, both physical and perhaps emotional, Henry turned to the so-called soothing tonics prescribed by his court physicians. These were not benign herbal remedies. Indeed, they were rudimentary precursors of modern opiates, mighty concoctions that included tinctures of poppy and extracts laced with much harsher substances. They numbed a body ravaged by decay. They offered respite from sleepless nights and bursts of unwarranted fury. Yet this reliance came at a cost. His letters grew erratic, his judgments increasingly paranoid. His relationship with food spiraled into indulgence turned obsession. Lavish feasts became a form of desperate therapy, overflowing with rich meats, decadent sweets, and heady wines, as if these extravagant displays of abundance could conceal his physical decline. His portraits, which present him as a regal figure clad in gleaming armor, obscure a less palatable truth. By the 1540s, he required mechanical assistance just to lift himself into bed. Nevertheless, the notion of addiction was an unfathomable concept, especially for a king. When Henry requested wine at breakfast and opium at dinner, it was seen not as indulgence but as his divine right. His physicians, while aware of his declining health, delicately labeled his needs. The king requires his tincture, it's simply a matter of comfort for his majesty, a subtle loyalty ensconced in silence. Modern historians digging through court records and medical notes have illuminated what had remained unspoken. Henry VIII was, in truth, self-medicating to maintain his functionality. His notorious rages, dramatic executions, and abrupt shifts in religious policy began to appear less as the will of a divine ruler and more like responses to chemical imbalances. He was a king simultaneously empowered and thwarted by the very substances meant to sustain him. Despite his ailing body, the myth of his grandeur flourished. Power shielded him from scrutiny, and history transformed a bloated, pain-ridden individual into a national icon clad in shining armor. Yet, Henry VIII was not alone in his contradictions. A century later, another monarch would preach against vice from the pulpit while indulging in it in secret, until the boundary between moral integrity and personal duplicity dissolved into a hazy smoke. In the annals of history, we find ourselves captivated by King James I of England, who reigned from 1566 to 1625. It was in 1604 that he unleashed a fiery essay, a counterblast to tobacco dash, a scathing denunciation of smoking that painted the practice as visually repulsive, olfactorily offensive, mentally detrimental, and physically perilous. This manifesto, pulsating with fervor, underscored that James would not stand idly by as tobacco's smoky tendrils wove their way into society. However, the tale takes an intriguing twist, typical of royal complexities. While he crafted the era's most renowned anti-tobacco treatise, whispers of his own habits reveal a man who may have not entirely followed his own advice. In the days of his youth as James VI of Scotland, he mingled with courtiers indulging in tobacco, a fashionable import from the Spanish and Portuguese elite. Tobacco, prized luxury then, was shared among nobility in ornate pipes, and early accounts recount a tolerant young James enjoying it during social gatherings, particularly in the 80s, when smoking retained a medicinal reputation still enshrouded in exoticism. As he ascended to the thrones of Scotland and England, James transformed, politically, religiously, and rhetorically. His anti-tobacco essay emerged from an effort to present himself as a moral guardian of society, rising above vices and hypocrisy while decrying the tavern culture he believed was leading citizens astray. The prose was theatrical, likening tobacco smoke to the foul odors of inferno. Yet within the lavish court, the reality of his relationship with tobacco was murky at best. Some scholars speculate his vehement opposition stemmed more from personal discontent than from any firm principles. While no explicit evidence confirms him as a lifelong smoker, various contemporary notes, from Spanish diplomats to murmurs among visiting French nobles, suggest a past habit he had since discarded. One diplomat even implied that James's ardent disdain for smoking seemed suspiciously rehearsed, almost a desperate attempt to conceal a bygone fondness. Whether he grappled with addiction or merely dabbled remains shrouded in mystery. Undoubtedly, James devoted considerable energy to regulating both public conduct and his own public persona. His staunch anti-smoking campaign coincided conveniently with financial ambitions, enabling him to impose heavy taxes on tobacco imports while denouncing it, a clever maneuver that masked opportunism with an air of virtue. Ultimately, it's not about whether King James smoked secretly or indulged in his youth. The profound significance lies in his need to vehemently renounce tobacco for public consumption, revealing the lifelong struggle between his private desires and his royal role, an internal conflict echoed centuries later by another royal figure. A fragile queen, mourning her losses, found solace in clandestine sips of brandy, even as the world hailed her as Britain's final great sovereign. 9. Queen Anne, 1665 to 1714. To the public eye, Queen Anne stood as a figure of fragility and divine perseverance. A soft-spoken ruler, she carried great burdens, reigning reluctantly while enveloped in prayer. History, however, has not cast her in a grand light. As the last Stuart monarch, her reign was overshadowed by relentless tragedy, war, and a life seemingly split between mourning and devotion. Yet, beneath her grave facade, there lay an unending battle against both physical and emotional torment. Into that sphere of silence crept one insidious comfort: alcohol. Anne's time on the throne was fraught with contradictions. She was both a sovereign and a sorrowful figure, a leader and a recluse. The loss of 17 children, through miscarriages, stillbirths, and untimely deaths, was no mere statistic. It was a lingering trauma, magnified by chronic illnesses like gout, and a condition then vaguely called dropsy, which included ailments that caused swelling and heart issues. In her later years, she moved with great difficulty, often needing help or being carried in a sedan chair. Yet, even amidst her vulnerability, the expectation was that she present herself as regal and commanding. Many royals, in the face of such struggles, have sought solace in private rituals. Letters, court diaries, and veiled poetry indicate that Anne increasingly turned to wine and brandy, not in the public spotlight but in secluded quarters, where she could embrace her humanity without fear of judgment. References to her alcohol consumption were rarely explicit in formal documentation, often disguised under terms like medicinal comforts or the cordial cup. One physician, in a confidential letter, described her evening tonics as strengthening, albeit discreetly so. Those closest to her were well aware. At times, her ladies-in-waiting discovered her in slumber during the afternoons, claiming headaches to escape from obligations. Whispers circulated among ministers about her distant demeanour and weary mind. Her complicated friendships, particularly with Sarah Churchill, the Duchess of Marlborough, were further complicated in her letters, which historians assert were shaped by an intertwining of pain, medications, and wine. The political climate called for a stoic figurehead, and sought to maintain that image. She attended church services diligently, supported religious scholarship, and avoided the extravagance that marred prior kings and queens. However, the reality behind the scenes was far more intimate and accessible. Rather than a form of rebellion, alcohol became her balm, a way to cope with the crushing sorrow, expectations, and deterioration. In an age devoid of modern antidepressants or effective pain relief, wine often served as the sole source of solace that didn't involve leeches or bloodletting. Unlike her successors, and lacked the advantage of a modern public relations apparatus. Nevertheless, the court was cautious in curating her public image. When she missed appearances, official statements cited her health issues, and when her speech slurred or she stumbled, it was attributed to fever or swelling, never to the brandy that might have steadied her nerves. Queen Anne passed away at the age of 49, worn down, swollen, and heavily sedated, both by medicine and her own means. Officially, her death was recorded as resulting from gout and dropsy. Yet underneath this diagnosis lay a life of enduring pain, met with quiet dependency, and was not the first royal to mask vulnerability through indulgent habits. Just a generation earlier, another monarch, renowned for his libertine zeal, engaged in his own nightly escapade, one filled not just with pleasure but also with tonics, powders, and the medicinal toxins of his time. King Charles II, born in 1630 and reigning until 1685, carried the moniker of the Merry Monarch. Yet, the laughter and revelry often concealed a deeper turbulence. Behind the grandeur of endless festivities and numerous affairs lay an unquenchable energy, fueled by a daily regimen of potions. Charles didn't merely indulge in the pleasures of life. He relied on an array of 17th-century concoctions, many containing opium, mercury, and other narcotics, designed to mask the toll of his frenetic lifestyle. To his supporters, he was a charismatic figure who revitalized the royal court after the severe years of Puritan rule, reinvigorating music, theatre, and fashion. However, medical records depict a different narrative. He was a man of paradoxes, vibrant by day but plagued by sleeplessness and fatigue when darkness fell. His remedy came in the form of elixirs prescribed by royal apothecaries, bottles boasting names like the King's Strengthening Draught, concealing potent and addictive substances. Charles's health weaknesses remained mostly hidden, but his correspondence with physicians painted a troubling picture of persistent ailments, headaches, exhaustion, and mood swings that plague him. His reliance on both invigorating and sedative remedies was not unique among royalty, yet Charles's persona was intricately intertwined with these dependencies. Unlike his father, Charles I, remembered for his Samba legacy, Charles II spun the monarchy into a dazzling masquerade, holding lavish balls during tumultuous times and cracking jokes amid political debates. When faced with bodily rebellions, he simply increased his doses. The irony is striking. Many of the same doctors administering his remedies would later rush to save him from their effects. In his final days, Charles experienced what was labeled a sudden illness, a probable stroke, exacerbated by years of lifestyle choices and substance use. His doctors employed every 17th century method available, an all too familiar slow-motion catastrophe. He passed away surrounded by alchemists and astrologers, with jars of tinctures close at hand, yet the public remembers him as the ever-joyful king, a generous spirit taken too soon. The facade of health camouflaged the deterioration beneath the crown. Charles II was not alone in this dance of indulgence. One of his nephews would inherit not just the throne, but also the allure of risk, leaving behind a shadowy legacy of debts and addictions, concealed from the public eye, marking a royal lineage tainted by silence. Prince Frederick, Duke of York, the son of King George III, often resonates in nursery rhymes as the general who led his troops up the hill only to march them back down. Yet, his true legacy transcends poetic notions. As the Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, he was the architect of military reforms that would fortify Britain's defences for years. However, underneath his public facade as a poised military leader lay a compulsive gambler and heavy drinker, indulging in extravagances not entirely his own. While socially acceptable among the elite, Frederick's gambling habits spiraled into obsession, often leading him to debts exceeding his means. The irony. His lifestyle was funded by taxpayers and royal privilege. His financial troubles escalated at an alarming pace. Contemporary letters from creditors and hushed exchanges among officers painted a picture of a man ensnared in a web of debt, requiring the intervention of Parliament to retrieve him from his financial turmoil. However, these matters were delicately handled behind closed doors, preserving the royal dignity amidst financial strains. Frederick's penchant for alcohol, a common indulgence of the time, became a nightly ritual for unwinding and celebration, often following evenings of gambling or court affairs. His declining health and increasing absences did not tarnish the loyalty of his friends, as his royal status made his habits less of a concern and more of an endearing quirk. Yet, the facade occasionally faltered. One notable incident was the Mary Ann Clark scandal, where his past mistress was embroiled in accusations of selling army commissions, allegedly with his knowledge. This affair, though he denied any complicity, threatened to tarnish his reputation, forcing a temporary resignation from his military role. While his vices remained unspoken in public discourse, historians suggest that his chaotic lifestyle made him susceptible to manipulation. Despite these challenges, Frederick managed to reinstate himself in public service and ultimately passed away with much of his reputation intact. History often celebrates him as a reformer in the military world, the royal uncle who professionalized British defense, conveniently overlooking his personal struggles. Yet, beneath the uniform and regal title was a man wrestling with the pressures of expectation. Frederick's reliance on gambling and alcohol mirrors a broader royal experience, where, in moments of private despair, another ruler reaching for solace amidst grief found it in a more potent elixir, forever cloaked in melancholy. Queen Victoria, spanning from 1819 to 1901, ruled for over 6 decades, overseeing an empire so extensive that it was famously said the sun never set upon it. She epitomized the ideals of devoted widowhood, national stability, and imperial strength. Yet, hidden beneath her somber black attire and solemn proclamations lay a woman coping with profound sorrow through years of self-medication. This was a queen whose emotional turmoil was not only managed by tradition and ritual, but also through a routine reliance on laudanum and chloroform. To grasp her dependence, one needs to delve into her profound losses. The death of Prince Albert in 1861 plunged Victoria into a mourning that transcended mere royal performance and spiraled into an extensive psychological retreat. Draped in black for the remainder of her days, she shunned public engagement for years and insisted that her husband's chambers remain untouched. To the world, this mourning was a declaration of virtue, but for Victoria, it was far more, a persistent ache that never truly healed. Laudanum, an opium-laced tincture, was a staple in Victorian medicine, often sold without prescription and marketed as a cure-all, capable of inducing addiction for ailments ranging from headaches to melancholia. Victoria's physicians tactfully prescribed it to facilitate sleep, alleviate stress, or soothe her so-called nerves, cleverly masking the truth. The Queen was consuming an opiate routinely to address emotional wounds that no public display could mend. Her diaries, though prudently curated by her daughter Beatrice, reveal glimpses of this dependency with phrases acknowledging her need for drops, cordial, and the doctor's draft emerging during moments of profound stress or distress. Following tough meetings with ministers or commemorating Albert's death, she often emerged drained and trembling, leading her physicians to observe her growing tolerance to these substances, necessitating larger doses for the same calming effect. Then there was chloroform, the trendy anesthetic of the mid-19th century. When Victoria gave birth to her 8th and 9th children, she opted for chloroform to manage pain, a choice that sparked controversy. Critics claimed she was shunning the natural agony of motherhood, yet she defended her decision unwaveringly. In private correspondences, she called it a blessed remedy, soothing in ways beyond description. This marked another discreet step towards chemical solace in a life governed by rigid customs and emotional restraint. This side of Victoria remained obscured from the public eye. The portrayal of her later years was carefully curated. She was the revered grandmother of Europe, a matriarch of monarchy, and a figure representing the moral values of the Victorian era. The narrative of her alleged self-sedation with narcotic tinctures was too troubling to confront. Her struggles were reduced to footnotes, and her grief transformed into legend. Yet, even behind the veil of legendary status, she remained profoundly human. Victoria's reliance on substances was not an escape. Rather, it was an attempt to contain her sorrow and anxiety, balancing the enormous pressures of embodying an empire while unraveling in solitude. And she was not alone. Her grandson, Albert Edward, Duke of Clarence, was next in line for the throne until he vanished into the annals of royal folklore, surrounded by whispers of scandal and a death shrouded in enigma. In the shadows of history lies Prince Albert Edward, Duke of Clarence, a figure marked by both promise and tragedy from 1864 to 1892. The title of heir apparent seemed destined for him, yet Albert Victor flickered in and out of the royal narrative, vanishing into obscurity and speculation. The eldest son of the future King Edward VII and Queen Victoria's grandson, he seemed poised to ascend the throne. However, his untimely death at 28 left a trail of unanswered queries. Official accounts blame pneumonia, stemming from influenza, but behind the public facade lies a much murkier reality. Rumors of his struggles with alcohol, morphine, and a yearning for solace in an oblivion weave their way through accounts of his brief existence. On the surface, he portrayed the ideal young royal, attractive, elegantly attired, and dutiful. Yet, his tutors noted a troubling trend. He often appeared distracted, marked as kind-hearted yet elusive, retreating into his own thoughts. The monarchy attempted to mold him into a leader, sending him from one institution to another, all the while he remained an enigma. As Albert Victor navigated his 20s, he garnered a reputation for gentleness rather than scandal. He shunned the responsibilities of leadership for the comforts of ease. Observing officers remarked on his growing fondness for alcohol, a notable trend that hinted at deeper troubles. Rumors, though perpetually denied, suggested he might be struggling with morphine addiction, a popular remedy of that era. His correspondence seemed to diminish, each letter more brief than the last, suggesting that even the act of writing wore him down. Despite the press of the time shielding the palace, his household harbored concerns over his well-being. His social engagements were meticulously managed by aides, often limited when he appeared unwell. The announcement of his engagement to Princess Mary of Teck sparked speculation about the sincerity of the union, with whispers questioning if it was a facade to mask growing apprehensions about his state. In 1892, the final chapter of his life unfolded, attributed to influenza and pneumonia, but the swiftness of his demise cast shadows on the official tale. Late biographers, armed with less sanitized records, speculated on the impact of potential substance use leading to respiratory failure. While the monarchy mourned the loss of their young prince, the reality of his life faded away into a curated narrative. As history would have it, his brother George would rise to become King George V, with Princess Mary at his side. Albert Victor, however, became a footnote, fading into obscurity. His struggles remained hidden beneath layers of myth and marble at Windsor Castle. Yet, the cycle of regal secrecy would continue, revealing yet another royal, a quiet naval officer who would cling to the very spirits that haunted Albert Victor. This officer's tumultuous story would unravel, revealing a king who not only wore a crown but also bore the weight of addiction within the throne room itself. Princess Alice of Battenberg, who lived from 1885 to 1969, may not initially seem a likely candidate among royals entangled in secret addictions. With no throne to her name and absent from the high society events that defined Europe's elite, her story is layered and poignant, a narrative that runs deeper than mere titles and royal lineage. Born into nobility, she married into it, and became the mother of royalty as well. Yet, much of her adult life unfolded in the shadows of the royal realm, hidden from sight and subdued by medication. Alice, the mother of Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, faced the world with the challenge of being deaf, yet she mastered the art of lip reading and communicated in several languages, a feat that hinted at her sharp intellect and tenacious character. She was once captivating, intelligent, and devout. However, after her marriage to Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark, her life was infiltrated by political turbulence, warfare, and personal chaos that eventually manifested in a clinical way. By the 1930s, her increasingly unpredictable behavior led to a diagnosis that would later stir debate among historians and psychologists: schizophrenia, a classification shrouded in controversy due to the vague nature of psychiatric science at the time and the spiritual essence of her symptoms. Alice believed she experienced divine messages and possessed healing abilities, but such claims were overwhelming for her aristocratic family and health caregivers. This troubling condition led to her forced internment in a Swiss sanatorium, a decision made against her will. What ensued was a dark chapter marked by enforced sedation, a troubling practice prevalent in pre-war Europe, yet seldom discussed thereafter. Records reveal that Alice was treated with early antidepressants, likely barbiturates that stifled both her visions and her voice, rendering her compliant. She wasn't indulging in recreational addiction. Rather, she was subdued into silence, a choice made by those surrounding her, not by her own volition. Her spiritual encounters were dismissed as mere symptoms, and her uniqueness misinterpreted as illness. The royal family chose to remain largely muted regarding this difficult period, with her children kept in the dark. Prince Philip was separated from her during her time in the institution, and correspondence within royal circles suggests that her circumstances were regarded as private embarrassment, a matter to be concealed or corrected. For a period, Alice completely vanished from public view, but astonishingly, she resurfaced during the tumult of World War II in Athens, transformed into a nun. In this new role, she founded a religious order, focusing on caring for the sick and safeguarding Jewish families from Nazi persecution. This renaissance in her life is just as enigmatic as her earlier decline. There are no comprehensive medical accounts or conclusive reasons for her transformation. It appears she had discovered a new purpose and identity, leaving behind her previous dependence on sedatives. Yet, the question lingers: Was Alice genuinely ill, or simply too vibrant to be constrained by the norms of her time? How many other royals, deemed eccentric or unstable, were similarly rendered invisible by medication? Remarkably, only a few decades later, another royal, charismatic and beloved by the public, would navigate a perilous double life, secretly wrestling with a long-term dependence on morphine and cocaine. Prince George, Duke of Kent, born in 1902 and passing in 1942, appeared to the world as the embodiment of modern royalty, elegant, attractive, and effortlessly worldly. He was the younger brother to both King Edward VIII and King George VI, marking his place in history as the first royal to engage in civilian employment. However, beneath the sharp uniforms and charismatic exterior lay a tumultuous life characterized by secrecy and dualities, intertwined with an addiction that grew increasingly difficult to hide. Caught in the shifting sands of time, Prince George embodied the grace of nobility while yearning for the simplicity of ordinary life. He held a position at the Foreign Office, pursued aviation, and mingled with the vibrant souls of artists and musicians, breaking free from the rigid confines of royal expectations. His social circles spanned across Europe's glittering cities, from Paris to Vienna and Berlin, yet alongside him travelled his dependencies, openly contrasting the discreet struggles of his royal kin. While other members of the royal family veiled their vices behind euphemisms, George's battles with morphine and cocaine have been recorded in considerable detail, not through royal announcements but via biographers, files made public, and the waning barriers of post-war privacy. His drug issues are thought to have initiated in the late 1920s, possibly during a time rife with personal turmoil and professional discontent. It became less about escaping reality and more about a desire for control, or at least the facade of it. While morphine dulled the pangs of stress, cocaine strikingly sharpened his dulled senses, creating a challenging cycle of dependency. Those who were close to him witnessed drastic shifts in his demeanor. Moments of intense exuberance alternated with heavy periods of withdrawal. In seclusion, he wrestled with restlessness and unpredictability, yet in public, he shone brightly, skillfully maintaining a facade that became increasingly difficult to uphold. The royal family, maintaining their perennial calm, executed a series of quiet interventions, offering him structured roles that necessitated travel, including a return to naval service and a role in the burgeoning Royal Air Force. On the surface, he was dutifully serving his nation. Behind the curtain, he was being strategically managed and contained. Rumors suggested that MI5 kept an eye on his activities, not out of concern for his loyalty, but because of fears that his lifestyle could lead to scandal or exposure. His untimely death in 1942, in a peculiar plane crash in Scotland, only intensified the mysteries surrounding him. Official reports indicated he was on a military mission, yet questions lingered. Why was he flying so far from battle? What was a civilian doing aboard? Why did the records regarding the crash take so long to declassify? Conspiracy theories filled the void left by silence, yet one truth remained. Despite his charm and privilege, George was a man wrestling in shadows with addiction, a struggle that might have contoured and ultimately limited his life. In the end, his dependency remained an unspoken truth, overshadowed by narratives of military valor and patriotic commitment. Yet, over time, the truth emerged, revealing a royal figure adrift, trying to balance public persona with a consuming addiction. And the weight of this pressure, an expectation to conform, to perform, and to remain silent, would echo across generations, affecting not just Prince George but also his brother, who bore a subtler burden of dependence, hidden behind palace walls and muffled by the clinking of glasses amidst a facade of duty. Prince Henry, Duke of Gloucester, born in 1900 and passing in 1974, stood in stark contrast to his adventurous younger brother, George, Duke of Kent. While George lived a life shrouded in glamour and intrigue, Henry embodied a sense of duty and restraint, deliberately avoiding the limelight. He seldom gave interviews, kept his thoughts concealed, and faded into the background, a royal presence that stirred little public interest. Yet, beneath this mundane facade lay a personal battle. He grappled silently with a long-standing addiction to alcohol. As the third son of King George V and Queen Mary, Henry occupied a public role laden with expectations yet devoid of real authority. Like many royal siblings destined for lives marked by service rather than rule, he ventured into a military career, serving with understated honor, first in the army and later in various ceremonial positions throughout the Commonwealth. His life, devoid of scandal and headlines, was punctuated by subtle patterns of behavior and hushed murmurs. Unlike his more extravagant siblings, Henry's drinking habits remained private, not a spectacle, but instead a consistent and discreet ritual that, as noted by several aides, became increasingly habit-forming as time passed. In an era where heavy drinking was commonplace among the upper classes, Henry's dependents managed to evade sensationalism, notable only for its duration and careful concealment. Internal palace communications and testimonies from royal staff reveal that Henry imbibed daily, often in the evenings, but sometimes during the day, yet never exhibited violent or unpredictable behavior. Instead, he grew more withdrawn. As years passed, his public appearances waned, and his ability to engage in lengthy speeches or tours diminished, often attributed to vague reasons like health issues, fatigue, or simply advancing age. Yet, beneath these justifications, concern about his dependency was mounting. Correspondence from his private secretaries, now archived, discusses his delicate health with caution and mentions modifications to his engagements based on his condition. Those around him applied subtle strategies to accommodate his needs, shortening public events, discreetly managing refreshments at official functions, and delaying early morning commitments when warranted. Throughout these struggles, Henry showed unwavering loyalty to the royal institution, refraining from public complaints, sympathy-seeking, or any breach of decorum. His alcohol use never scandalized the monarchy or captured media headlines. It became an unremarkable aspect of his existence, a means to cope with the demands of his royal responsibilities, which often felt purposeless. Following a series of strokes in the 1960s, the palace attributed his deterioration to natural aging, rarely acknowledging the potential impact of his prolonged drinking. He passed away in 1974 at the age of 74, largely overlooked by the public, yet remembered in royal circles as a quiet figure. Quiet, a term that can suggest loyalty yet also evokes loneliness. Prince Henry's narrative is not an isolated tale. It is part of the broader lineage of royals who managed their struggles away from the public eye, resorting to substances to cope with pressures unseen by the world. Intriguingly, his lineage connects to another enigmatic royal, a figure from the Victorian era mired in mystery and scandal, whose battles with alcohol and addiction have been almost erased from the public consciousness, a prince whose life ended prematurely, leaving behind not only a troubled legacy but also a carefully orchestrated royal concealment. 17. Prince Albert Victor, 1864 to 1892. Often known simply as Eddie, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Eindale, stands as one of the most enigmatic figures in the narrative of the British monarchy. Officially recognized as the eldest son of the future King Edward VII, he held the second position in the line of succession, seemingly destined to ascend to the throne, albeit for a fleeting moment. Yet, beneath the weight of royal expectations lay a young man engulfed in personal turmoil, frail health, and the murmur of scandal. His untimely death at merely 28 was publicly commemorated, hailed as the cruel whim of fate. Yet, intertwined with the grand ceremonies and heartfelt tributes was a more intricate reality. Eddie's existence was marred by patterns of chronic substance use, predominantly linked to alcohol and gambling, carefully concealed by the discretion of the palace. From his youth, Albert Victor grappled with the daunting image imposed upon him as a potential monarch. Though often described as charming, he was perceived as intellectually shallow, a euphemism for his susceptibility to distraction and outside influence, ultimately falling short of understanding the comprehensive nature of his duties. Tutors, military officers, and political advisers found him challenging, yet admitted to his gentle nature and his desire to please. However, this gentleness may have rendered him vulnerable. Gossip swirled and unofficial accounts claim that, by his early 20s, Albert Victor had developed a pronounced affinity for alcohol. Common among the aristocracy of his era, for him it became a more ingrained habit. Frequent visits to gentlemen's clubs, well known for their card games and late-night brandy, became the norm. Several biographers recount reports of his return from social gatherings in states deemed unsuitable for public view, a euphemism likely masking open intoxication. Additionally, rumors of substantial gambling debts persisted, though quantifying their extent proved difficult due to the scarce formal documentation, reflecting how adept the royal household managed its affairs. Debts were settled, public images preserved, and narratives sanitized. As with numerous royals, the palace machinery did not resolve the underlying issues. It simply wiped the records clean. In the latter stages of his brief life, Eddie's health deteriorated, leaving him increasingly fatigued and susceptible to illness. Official accounts state he contracted influenza during the 1891-92 pandemic, leading to pneumonia that took him within days. Yet, overwhelming evidence suggests that years of heavy drinking, a poor diet, and potential substance misuse had already compromised his immune system. Some historians have even suggested signs of morphine use, a sedative of that era, often freely prescribed for various ailments. Upon his death, public sorrow was swift and profound. Newspapers overflowed with emotional tributes, and Queen Victoria reportedly grieved deeply for him. Without hesitation, the royal family adapted the line of succession while neglecting to confront the more significant ramifications of his lifestyle. His younger brother George ascended as King George V, while Prince Albert Victor became a kind of royal spectre, remembered more for the throne he might have occupied than for the man he truly was. His struggles, frailties, and subtle deterioration were woven into the broader Victorian narrative of repression and controlled memory. Officially, he was a prince of promise, but privately, those close to him understood he had begun to fade long before illness claimed him. The cycle continued, proving yet again that the throne offers no guarantees of peace. In the next tale, we discover a king burdened by migraines and a divine right, driven to seek solace in opiates masquerading as medicinal relief, until his crown hovered atop a cloud of meticulously managed oblivion. As we delve into the life of King William IV, born in 1765 and passing in 1837, we uncover a man whose experiences could fill 3 biographies. Before ascending the throne, William was a sailor, a figure of scandal, a hesitant royal, and an unpredictable force in politics. Originally the 3rd son of George III, his journey began in the Royal Navy, a realm governed by strict discipline and fortified spirits. Here, he developed an early affection for strong alcohol which would accompany him from the tumult of naval life to the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Publicly known as the Sailor King, William embraced this image, blending sincerity and a touch of detachment from royal pomp. Yet, this persona camouflaged a deeper truth, a long-term struggle with alcohol born not from the elegance of palace life, but from the rough, raucous world of naval taverns and cramped ship quarters. His heavy drinking during his sailor years, rum, brandy, and fortified wines, was well known, and his sparse diaries detail numerous instances of restorative beverages consumed around official duties. Friends and fellow officers observed his increasingly erratic behavior in the evenings, often dismissed as mere quirks of a sailor, but now understood by historians as indicators of a chronic drinking habit. By the time he took the throne in 1830 after the demise of his brother George IV, the kingdom anticipated turmoil. Instead, they received a ruler more capable than anticipated, yet whose private indulgences were meticulously managed by his staff. Unlike his brother, who veiled his vices with extravagance, William normalized his drinking, particularly at night, with aids ensuring his supply was always discreetly available. His temper, already sharp, could escalate further after a few drinks, prompting prime ministers like Lord Melbourne to hone the tricky skill of managing a tipsy king without plunging the country into crisis. To the public eye, William's flaws transformed into endearing traits. His rugged demeanor suggested authenticity, portraying him as a monarch in touch with his people, a man who understood both the rigors of sea and sovereignty. Satirical cartoons depicted him raising a glass, not out of mockery, but affectionately, as a national figure who was gruff yet approachable. Upon his death at the age of 71, widely seen as a noteworthy milestone, he bequeathed a tangled legacy, without legitimate heirs, marked by a blend of constitutional area and unrefined personal habits. But lurking beyond his narrative was another royal, one who shrouded his struggles with spirituality and pain. This king, despite his devoutness, grappled with dependencies that may have only grown stronger beneath the surface, illustrating the complex, intertwined lives of monarchy and human frailty. King Charles I, who reigned from 1600 to 1649, is often remembered not for the life he led, but for the dramatic way in which he met his end, tried and executed in front of his own people, a monarch brought down by internal strife rather than external foes. His legacy serves as a potent reminder of the clash between unchecked authority and the will of the masses, presenting a blend of admiration and tragedy. Yet, beneath the gilded drapery of his reign, there lay a weight that he bore alone, the toll of chronic migraines and a secret reliance on opium-laced tinctures that blurred the distinction between royal duties and a medicated existence. Unlike his more flamboyant successors, Charles I's court was marked by restraint, dignity, and a somber tone. He lacked the charisma of his father, James I, and the extravagant charm of his son, Charles II. Rather, he was earnest and steadfast, yet consistently tormented by relentless pain that struck unexpectedly, leaving him pale and often retreating to the safety of his chambers. His physicians spoke of his ailments in veiled terms. Phrases like royal heaviness hinted at a deeper malaise. Historical records, however, about the king's health, including physician letters and accounts from close associates, suggest that Charles suffered from severe migraines. To cope with this affliction, he turned to the medical remedies available at the time, particularly a preparation known as LDUM, a potent blend of alcohol and opium that served as both a sedative and analgesic. In the world of 17th century medicine, it was a trusted, albeit risky, treatment. For Charles, LDUM was a double-edged sword. It eased his pain sufficiently for him to engage in critical state functions, yet it left him sluggish and increasingly reliant on a substance that remained unspoken among his courtiers. The use of these tinctures was not a closely guarded secret. Physicians documented necessary adjustments to his dosages over time. One doctor noted how the king would quiet down after taking his medicine, while another referenced Charles seeking medicinal respite following prolonged meetings. This reliance on opiate tinctures became particularly clear during the tumultuous final years of his reign when civil unrest escalated into war, and the burdens of kingship became overwhelming. As challenges mounted, from betrayal to the disintegration of his royal stature, Charles leaned further into ritual, clinging to the philosophies of divine rite and liturgy, while increasingly seeking solace in the numbness brought by medication. While there is no evidence that he misused his tinctures for enjoyment, it is clear that his ability to navigate the intricacies of leadership relied upon them. His execution in 1649 represented a pivotal chapter in British history, not merely sealing his fate but also solidifying his legacy as a martyr, portrayed as a serene figure in the face of death. Yet, the opiate dependency remained a hush-hush topic, overshadowed by the narrative of martyrdom. Discussing the medicinal draughts offered before his final moments would have disrupted the sanctity of his myth. This hidden battle reflects a broader theme in the history of monarchy, the image of the sovereign meticulously upheld, even as the human beneath grapples with invisible dependencies. Charles I was not alone in this struggle. Soon after, another royal, born in exile and master of contradictions, would navigate his own path through crises with the aid of alcohol, yet that addiction was charmingly packaged as conviviality by those tasked with preserving his image. Prince Augustus Frederick, Duke of Sussex, lived from 1773 to 1843, and among the progeny of King George III, he epitomized both uniqueness and underlying turmoil. While his brothers were embroiled in political clashes, military commands, and regal pursuits, Augustus charted a different course, one marked by a more subtle form of rebellion. His battles were fought against courtly norms, the shackles of tradition, and an increasing dependence on opium-laced sleeping remedies, the only true solace he found. As the Duke of Sussex, Augustus was acutely aware that the throne was never meant for him. This realization may have granted him a peculiar kind of freedom, or perhaps it became a convenient justification for his unconventional lifestyle. He boldly opposed the Royal Marriages Act, defied his father by marrying for love twice without royal approval, and shunned any pretense of adhering to the rigid expectations of Georgian nobility. Yet, beneath his defiant exterior lay a man tortured by sleepless nights. In correspondence with those closest to him, he conveyed struggles with insomnia so relentless that they hampered his daily existence, detailing his unnerving wakefulness, nightmares, and an ever-racing mind. In a time when tumultuous feelings were often treated with elixirs instead of therapy, Augustus found himself prescribed nightly tonics, liquid remedies that frequently contained laudanum, a potent mix of alcohol and opium. Such concoctions were widely accepted as commonplace medicine in the early 1800s, embraced by everyone from artists to statesmen. However, regular consumption led to a subtle and troubling dependence, one that became a fixture of Augustus's routine. Records from his household revealed that these tonics were administered almost every night in his later years. A valet noted that sleep was elusive without his warm mixture, flavored with mint to soothe his stomach. This routine, while cloaked in domesticity, revealed a more unsettling reality. The Duke of Sussex was no longer able to find rest on his own. Despite his afflictions, Augustus actively participated in public life, championing Jewish emancipation, supporting the arts and sciences, even presiding over the Royal Society. Yet, acquaintances observed that he often appeared hazy or disengaged during morning engagements, his thoughts slower to ignite, his speech more measured. While these signs could easily be attributed to age, they were more likely a result of his nightly potions. Miraculously, Augustus never encountered scandal over his opium use. His dependency remained hidden from the public eye, framed as a medical necessity within courtly circles. The palace saw no threat. He was simply a gentle, weary prince in need of a little assistance. Thus, his nightly remedies were prepared and presented without hesitation. He passed away in 1843 at the age of 70, remembered as a gracious and principled royal who lived life on his own terms. His personal battles, his secretive marriages, relentless insomnia, and unacknowledged reliance on substances were carefully omitted from public record. Yet, Augustus was not alone. Mere years later, another royal figure, a woman plagued by fragile nerves and reliant on her own vials of laudanum, would be described not as an addict, but merely unwell, a condition gently disguised by the delicate language of Victorian propriety. 21. Princess Mary, Duchess of Gloucester, lived from 1776 to 1857. The last surviving offspring of King George III, by the time she drew her final breath in 1857, she had transformed into a living testament of a bygone era. Outliving her siblings and her niece, Queen Adelaide, Mary became a link between the ages, a quietly managed royal, observing a monarchy in flux. Yet, while her legacy is often portrayed gently, as the beautiful daughter, the humble duchess, and the elderly aunt of Queen Victoria, her later years reveal a more intricate narrative, marked by a private dependence on ladanum, the 19th century's commonly accepted sedative. Not a queen, nor a central figure in the political realm, Mary navigated a unique position in the royal hierarchy, significant enough to matter, yet often unnoticed. Her public appearances were rare, and her personal life, especially post-marriage to her cousin, Prince William Frederick, Duke of Gloucester, was characterized by rigidity and emotional distance. Childless, increasingly alone, and overshadowed by vibrant royals of the Victorian period, Mary became known within palace walls as a creature of habit. However, beneath her routine lay a concealed battle with health. Like many women of her time, Mary was labeled as having fragile nerves, an umbrella term for anxiety, depression, and hormonal changes. Her particular case involved debilitating headaches, fatigue, and what doctors termed melancholic temperament. The era's understanding of mental health was limited, yet numerous remedies existed, with LDUM being the most prevalent. This opium-based tincture was freely prescribed with no stigma attached. For women of the upper class, it was as ubiquitous as tea, always present in the medicine cabinet and evening ritual. For Mary, it was a means to ease the physical trials of aging and the emotional burdens of an existence largely spent in the shadows of royal significance. Personal letters, discovered years later, frequently mentioned restorative drops and evening tonics. Although the exact dosages remain unclear, the pattern indicates a notable reliance. Her previously vibrant correspondences dwindled into brief notes where she expressed a need for quietude or comfort from a tonic. Observers noted her growing inclination towards solitude, an aversion to travel, and long hours spent behind draped curtains in her chambers. Yet, to the outside world, Mary was a paragon of grace. Respected and revered, she was deemed a survivor, the last child of a deranged king, who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires with unwavering composure. However, that composure was carefully maintained, not through scandal or spectacle, but through discreet physicians, handwritten prescriptions, and nightly doses of something stronger than tea. When she passed in 1857 at the age of 81, a remarkable age for her time, Mary left no children to recount her story, and no scandals to create a ripple in tabloid history. Her public memory remained pristine, gentle, and honorable, unscathed by controversy. Yet, the reality resided in the silence, in the carefully administered doses, in the way her struggles were minimized as mere nerves, and in how her dependency, much like that of countless women of her class and era, was artfully masked as self-care. Just a generation later, that very royal reticence would conceal yet another child, a young prince afflicted with a rare condition that demanded ongoing medication, his existence shrouded behind towering garden walls, and his brief, heavily sedated life would become one of the monarchy's darkest secrets. 22. Prince John, 1905 to 1919. In the captivating tale of the House of Windsor, few echoes resound with such melancholy as that of Prince John, the youngest offspring of King George V and Queen Mary, and arguably the most deliberately hidden from view. Born into a realm of opulence, surrounded by royal protocols and grandeur, John's fate was largely sealed away from the public eye, tucked into obscurity, and, tragically, into the shadows of history. Official accounts cite his severe epilepsy and developmental issues as the reason for his withdrawal, while behind the scenes, his plight was managed through heavy doses of early barbiturates and sedatives, medications prescribed with almost unquestioned fervor in hopes of control and treatment. Initially, John experienced a typical upbringing for a prince, complete with nannies, tutors, garden play, and formal portraits. Yet, by the tender age of 4, the unsettling signs of his condition became apparent. Seizures surfaced, and developmental delays contradicted the royal narrative. In a dynasty where image, composure, and decorum were paramount, such unpredictability was not merely a challenge but a potential liability. What followed was a gradual retreat, a physical and symbolic withdrawal, as John was increasingly distanced from the heart of royal life, slipping deeper into managed silence. By 1917, at just 12 years old, John found himself secluded at Wood Farm on the Sandringham estate. Here, he was cared for by a devoted nurse, shielded from public scrutiny and to some extent, from his own family as well. Officially, his health was deemed delicate and in need of rest, euphemisms cloaking the rigorous medical regimen of the early 20th century, marked by sedative treatments. At the time, the consensus on managing epilepsy leaned heavily toward containment, both physical and chemical. Barbiturates, a recent addition to medical practices, were seen as a means to curtail seizures, soothe the nervous system, and, less openly acknowledged, diminish erratic behavior. For a royal child under constant observation, these medications were viewed as essential for protection, yet they exacted a significant toll. High doses led to lethargy, emotional dullness, and a sense of distance. Those few who had interactions with John during these years painted a portrait of a boy who, though kind, often seemed removed, perpetually fatigued, and intermittently unengaged in conversation. His existence contracted to a confined circle of caretakers, routine strolls in manicured gardens, and a meticulously regulated medical agenda, all orchestrated to preserve tranquility above all else. Visits from the royal family became scarce, whether due to emotional disconnect, societal pressures, or medical counsel. The result remained uniform. John became royal in name but not in presence. When he passed away in 1919 from a significant seizure, his memorial was a private affair, subdued and eclipsed by the tumultuous conclusion of World War I. Media coverage labeled him the little-known prince, while palace statements expressed a sense of relief that his suffering had concluded. It would take years for scholars and historians to gently pry open the serene yet complex narrative concealed behind palace walls. John's reliance on medication, while not addiction in a traditional sense, formed a dependency, medically enforced, socially perpetuated, and adorned in the guise of compassion. His story remains largely absent from royal retrospectives, his image sparsely displayed over decades. Yet, buried within his unseen life lies one of monarchy's most poignant truths. Within the cloistered walls, some existences are deemed too unpredictable for public insight, and some dependencies are neither chosen nor acknowledged but imposed quietly. Yet the royal narrative did not conclude with John. As the 20th century unfolded, another prince would rise, charismatic, stylish, restlessly ambitious, embarking on an alarming dependency of his own, not on barbiturates, but rather on stimulants, pep pills, alcohol, and hushed consultations with questionable medical advisors. 23. King Edward VII, 1894 to 1972. Long before the whispers of abdicating for love echoed through the halls of history, King Edward VIII was forging a different connection, not to authority or obligation, but to the erratic embrace of stimulants, alcohol, and the peculiar practices of private medicine. He was the exhilarating playboy who transitioned from prince to monarch, then into exile, known for his impeccable sartorial choices, sharp opinions, and a tendency towards defiance. Beneath his charming exterior and the infamous love affair with Wallis Simpson lay a hidden struggle, the quieter shadow of addiction. It wasn't destructive, nor overtly dramatic, yet it lingered, concealed by courtiers long after his departure from the throne. In the vibrant 1920s and 30s, the Prince of Wales captivated Britain, swirling into the public eye with infectious energy. He became a master of dance, a spirited horseman, a gifted speaker, and a globe-trotting figure who embodied the essence of a modern royal. However, the toll of maintaining such an image was profound. As revealed through declassified intel and the reflections of his close associates, Edward began to use amphetamines, colloquially known as pep pills. These stimulants, particularly prevalent during his busiest years in the 1930s, were often prescribed by a revolving door of private doctors, including the infamous Dr. John Bodkin Adams, a man suspected of excessive prescribing. Although no official records directly linked Adams to Edward's treatment, several reports indicated that the Prince of Wales sought invigorating injections before significant engagements and maintained a routine of daily tonics. The effects were unmistakable: bursts of vigor, moments of brilliance, and a growing sense of invulnerability that complemented his hefty alcohol consumption, often discreet yet substantial. His confidence tiptoed into impulsiveness, resulting in a persona viewed as magnetic yet unpredictable. Staff members observed a man deeply invested in his public persona, yet dangerously disengaged from the ramifications of his choices. The public engagement revealed a polished prince addressing crowds in impeccable accents, yet behind the closed doors of royal life, MI5 remained vigilant. Intelligence memos unearthed years later underscored concerns over Edward's dependence on stimulants and the influence of dubious physicians infiltrating through Wallis Simpson's connections. A Stark report from 1936 candidly described him as being in the care of questionable advisors whose motives lacked transparency. After his abdication, Edward's dependency did not vanish, it transformed. As the Duke of Windsor in exile, he continued to seek medical boosts, often in line with public appearances or simply out of boredom. His correspondence throughout the 1940s hinted at a proclivity for alternative therapies, energy enhancers, and focus aids. Concurrently, his consumption of alcohol grew more routine, a few cocktails preceding dinner and often more following it. It was never scandalous or openly dramatic, merely woven intricately into the fabric of his life beyond courtly restraint but not completely severed from the habits that had buoyed his existence. By the time Edward passed away in 1972, he embodied nostalgia, controversy, and a touch of historical discomfort. Conversations scarcely touched on the pills or drinks. Instead, his legacy mainly fixated on his decision to forsake the crown, overshadowing those quieter dependencies that may have rendered that choice his only semblance of freedom. Yet, within the very palace he abandoned, another figure braved the turmoil of a world war, not through grand speeches or controversies but embodying a serene composure. A queen, defined by elegant posture and unwavering dignity, who, amid global upheavals, opted for gentle sedatives instead of stimulants, steadfastly preventing even the slightest tremor in her teacup during public appearances. Queen Mary, who lived from 1867 to 1953, served as the consort to King George V, the mother of two kings, and the grandmother to a reigning queen. Yet sentimentality was not a trait attributed to her. Instead, her presence was defined by the stringent expectations of Edwardian society, cold and composed while radiating stunning beauty. She was a woman who would subtly correct grammar mid-sentence and meticulously catalogue porcelain by decade, reminding her lady-in-waiting to behave like a duchess, even in the face of impending faintness. However, beneath her steadfast exterior were hidden vulnerabilities. Within those fissures thrived an unseen struggle, as she quietly turned to sedatives and stimulants during the tumultuous periods of both world wars. The psychological strain of wartime Britain weighed heavily on the monarchy, transforming Queen Mary from a symbol of imperial strength into a burdensome icon during the Great War. She suffered familial losses, endured threats against her husband's life, and faced the challenges of a court mired in political turmoil and personal sorrow. Despite these trials, she was expected to embody unwavering national calmness. For decades, her health remained a closely guarded secret, with royal aides and court doctors remaining resolutely tight-lipped about her well-being. Yet, documents and private correspondence that emerged posthumously reveal a layered reality. A woman prescribed barbiturates to quell anxiety, restlessness, and the relentless strain of her public role. Barbiturates, the prominent sedatives of her time, were administered to enable sleep and soothe nerves, ensuring she could perform her royal duties. Medical logs from the 1910s onwards frequently reference her restorative drops and evening elixirs. During the Blitz, even as she boldly refused to leave London, reports noted her calm demeanor, likely attained with chemical support, despite her sleep deprivation. As she aged, mild stimulants became routine during her extensive royal engagements. Though not illicit, these substances were rigorously prescribed, becoming integral to her daily existence, even amidst the fray outside her palace. What distinguishes Queen Mary's narrative is not the reliance on these substances, but rather how effortlessly they intertwined with the fabric of monarchy. Her dependence did not equate to weakness. It never threatened the royal image. She stood unwavering, never faltering or shedding tears in public. Instead, these medications perpetuated the facade of royal invincibility throughout wars and national turmoil. By the time of her passing in 1953, just before her granddaughter, Queen Elizabeth II coronation, tributes hailed her legacy, without a whisper of her extensive medicinal routine. She had fulfilled her role with grace and resilience, steadfastly embodying the royal ideal. Yet, not every royal found solace in chemical serenity. Some confronted stress head-on, with fervor rather than restraint. One king would emerge in history, not for his downfall, but for unabashedly showcasing his struggle with inebriation, a tragic reminder of the human frailty that often lurked behind the regal facade. James II reigned from 1633 to 1701. Before his exile, prior to the glorious revolution that saw him fleeing England, King James II was a man in pursuit of dominance, over his court, his kingdom, his faith, and gradually, over his growing reliance on brandy. His legacy largely revolves around politics. He was the Catholic monarch who lost his predominantly Protestant realm. Yet beyond the conflicts surrounding religious tolerance and absolute monarchy lies a more profound account, a royal's retreat into drink not solely for enjoyment, but as a means of finding stability. Unlike his flamboyant brother, Charles II, whose court radiated excess and ostentation, James presented a more austere image, at least on the surface. He was often viewed as pious, serious, and staunchly adherent to the divine right of kings. Yet behind closed doors, his fondness for brandy grew stronger, a habit that had nurtured since his naval days and intensified amid political challenges. It wasn't ostentatious or dramatic, but rather a measured, habitual consumption. Evidence of this dependence surfaces in personal letters exchanged by those around him. Diplomats, ambassadors, even his own aides noted his reliance on cordials and warm brandy, especially during troubled times or late-night strategizing. A French courtier remarked during James's exile that the king was seldom seen without a glass, drinking deeply but appearing composed. These words, never with visible disorder, illustrated the careful facade he maintained, despite the personal cost. At court, James's drinking habit was largely overlooked. It blended into the royal routine, unchallenged and seldom commented upon. After all, in the 17th century, brandy was considered medicinal, prescribed for everything from digestion to melancholy. However, for James, the frequency of his drinking and the emotional tether to it raised subtle alarms. One chaplain noted in a letter, now preserved at Lambeth Palace, that the king increasingly relied on the solace of the bottle during darker times, times that, for him, were all too common. His reign was short and riddled with strife. His long-held secret conversion to Catholicism erupted into a public crisis upon assuming the throne, prompting pushback from Parliament and defection among nobility. With the birth of a Catholic heir, paranoia surged, compelling James to turn more towards his rituals, prayers, and the soothing comfort of evening brandy. When he was deposed in 1688 and fled to France, James maintained the facade of a king wronged. In exile, he painted himself as a martyr. However, even among fellow exiles, his drinking habits did not escape attention. A Jesuit advisor subtly remarked that the king's spirit was wounded. It seemed he sought solace in his brandy. James passed away in 1701, not in a dramatic crescendo but through a slow, silent decline in the opulent surroundings of another's palace. Officially, he left a legacy as a devout, exiled king. Unofficially, some remembered him as a man who drank steadily through the gradual collapse of his convictions. His legacy did not vanish with faith and failure. It lingered in quiet corners of Windsor, echoing in the life of another royal, a naval officer reminiscent of James, committed to service and marked by silence, a cigarette often resting between his fingers. Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, lived from 1921 to 2021, embodying many roles. A naval officer, devoted consort, war veteran, environmentalist, and often a source of sensational headlines, he was primarily a man who maintained a composed facade in public. For over 70 years, he stood just behind Queen Elizabeth II, quietly supportive, with a keen ability to express unfiltered thoughts, often voicing what others would not. His identity was forged through unvarnished honesty and a pragmatic outlook on life. Yet, a particular aspect of his life, seldom mentioned in speeches or history books, remained concealed: his long-term addiction to nicotine. Initiating smoking in his teenage years, a habit common for many in his era, Philip's relationship with cigarettes deepened during his time as a young naval officer in World War II, where smoking became as integral to his persona as his war medals. The Royal Navy not only accepted smoking but actively promoted it, deeming it a legitimate means of coping with stress and fostering camaraderie. By the time he wed Princess Elizabeth in 1947, reports claimed he was consuming up to 20 cigarettes daily, often caught in photographs with a cigarette mere inches out of sight, or with smoke subtly curling behind friendly gestures. Despite this, the public was mostly unaware of his smoking habit, not due to its absence, but because the palace adept crafted the image of a modern royal family. It was Queen Elizabeth who allegedly urged Philip to quit smoking soon after they married. According to palace insiders, he did so, at least intermittently. His relationship with cessation was tumultuous. Reports indicated relapses were common, as the pressures of royal life conflicted with his known restlessness and aversion to idleness. For decades, he cleverly maintained his smoking without it becoming public knowledge. Ashtrays were discreetly placed in private spaces, staff were advised to remain silent about it, and photographers were encouraged to avoid capturing unguarded moments. This concealment stemmed not from shame. Philip was not one to shy away easily, but rather from a sense of duty. He grasped the significance of image, and as the royal family evolved into a more polished and scrutinized entity, his personal vices were kept hidden from the public eye. While cigarettes never entirely vanished from his life, they were woven into the backdrop, present yet unacknowledged. Living until the age of 99, many pointed to his longevity as proof of his robust constitution. Few considered the extensive years spent smoking or the delicate balance struck between personal pleasures and public persona. Upon his passing, he exited the world as he lived, just out of the spotlight, steadfast, disciplined, and rich in contradictions. While his addiction remained a footnote in his storied life, the next generation of royals was destined to take center stage. Their struggles, in stark contrast, could not be hidden, manifesting in tabloid whispers and ultimately told by the one who endured them most profoundly. Princess Diana, born in 1961 and departed in 1997, represented, for countless admirers, the people's princess, a striking modern fairy tale gone awry, woven with elegance, heartbreak, and an unprecedented universal adoration that cast a shadow over the grandeur of Buckingham Palace. Yet, beneath the glimmering surface of humanitarian efforts and the tumult of her marriage, Diana was simply a woman ensnared in the relentless grip of societal expectations. She faced each day grappling with the weight of her royal duties and turned quietly to coping mechanisms such as disordered eating, sleeping aids, antidepressants, and periods of emotional disengagement, all revealed not through scandalous leaks but through her own voice. In the early chapters of royal life, Diana projected an image that was a stark juxtaposition, shining in public while retreating into herself when alone. The media lauded her beauty and charm, noting her ability to wear a smile even in adversity. Yet, close confidants, aides, and medical professionals recognized the profound psychological distresses dwelled beneath that radiant facade. At just 20, she stepped into a world of royalty with neither guidance nor respite, thrust into circumstances demanding immense emotional resilience. Her life became emblematic of a familiar plight faced by many entrapped in overpowering systems. Seize control of what you can. Diana was candid about her struggle with bulimia, a deeply personal battle that began around her engagement, surfacing as a response to the stress and anxiety fueled by the rigid image she felt compelled to uphold. But this was merely one fragment of a larger saga. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, reports indicated that she leaned on prescription medications to counter insomnia and anxiety, often disclosed in the discreet language of rest, innocent yet significant in royal contexts. Mild sedatives were employed to ease the tension ahead of public appearances and extensive travels. Coupled with her internal chaos and lack of personal freedom, her situation spiraled into sedation rather than relief. Diana's narrative defied the conventional tales surrounding royal figures and addiction. She was not lost in rampant revelries or chaotic collapses. Instead, she tirelessly engaged in her duties, addressing audiences, traversing perilous terrains, and extending compassion to AIDS patients even when ostracized by others. This profound dichotomy rendered her story perplexing. The pain she bore was ever present behind her captivating eyes, yet seldom acknowledged by a monarchy that demanded a perpetual smile. By the dawn of the 1990s, her facade began to fracture. Diana became more open about her experiences, first through private tapes, then interviews, culminating in her landmark 1995 panorama filling the airwaves. In these moments, she voiced struggles with bulimia, hurtful behaviors, and an overwhelming sense of disorientation. While she never labeled her behaviors as addiction, the cycle was unmistakable. She utilized every available resource, usually medicated, often discreetly, to endure a meticulously curated public image. Upon her tragic passing in 1997, a wave of sorrow spread worldwide. The royal family's reaction was measured and heavily scrutinized. The woman they sought to manage, control, and ultimately distance themselves from transformed into an indomitable emblem of emotional truth in death, a reality that the institution was ill-equipped to confront. Her legacy remains intricate, cherished, frequently misconstrued, and iconic. Yet, her battles with mental health, disorderly habits, and the invisible allure of medicinal solace are far from mere postscript. They enrich the narrative, not only hers but of a lineage, for one of her sons, nurtured in the same royal engine, would one day tread a similar path, wrestling with loss, the relentless pressure, and the yearning to obscure emotions the palace insisted remained unsaid, until the day he finally spoke out. Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, born in 1984, often seemed fated to embody the traditional role of royal second sons, a supportive figure, spirited yet sidelined. He was the spare, the younger sibling expected to assist, smile, and remain in the background. In his youth, Harry took on this identity with what appeared to be cheerful defiance. The mischievous prince, the soldier-turned-reveler, he often made headlines for his wild antics and relatable charm. Yet, beneath this facade lay a man silently unraveling, growing increasingly reliant on alcohol and cannabis to drown out the chaos within. What set Harry apart from generations of royals was not merely the dependence itself, but his decision to confront it openly. Through his memoir, Spare Dash, and countless interviews, he candidly detailed his struggles with heavy drinking and drug use, revealing the pain he had long buried beneath the surface. For once, addiction became a topic discussed in real time, rather than whispered about or obscured in euphemism. The trauma of losing his mother, Princess Diana, when he was just 12, left an indelible scar, one that royal decorum could never heal. From that moment, he became both a beacon and a captive of the monarchy. On the surface, he was expected to be stoic, but internally, he drifted through a haze of anxiety and anger, emotions he learned to mask rather than process. Alcohol provided a fleeting escape, and those close to him noted a pattern of heavy drinking, especially during his 20s, as he frequented London clubs late into the night. While the media framed his behavior as youthful rebellion, Harry later recast that time as a desperate attempt at self-medication, a bid to calm panic, grief, and resentment. Cannabis, too, became a coping mechanism during quieter moments away from his royal duties. While such habits were not chaotic, they were consistent enough to warrant concern. The most remarkable aspect of Harry's journey lies in the shift it embodies. In a family steeped in silence and hidden struggles, he chose the path of honesty. He sought therapy, dabbled in guided psychedelic treatments, and spoke of anxiety and post-traumatic stress, terms rarely uttered within royal circles. This choice disrupted not just his personal narrative, but also the carefully cultivated system of concealment within the palace. In Spare Dash, Harry doesn't elevate his habits to glorified status. He confronts the shame and confusion that once accompanied those coping strategies. His revelations are discomforting, particularly for an institution where emotional restraint is the norm. Yet, they herald a unique moment in royal history, marking an addiction openly acknowledged. The responses have been mixed, with some critiquing him for overexposure and traditionalists unhappy with his defiance of royal norms. Nevertheless, his story uniquely tackles addiction as part of universal human experience. Yet, even today, the royal family's internal struggles are not all addressed with such candor. For standing just across the family divide is another prince, older, more reserved, and less open about his own compulsions. His life, shadowed by whispers and allegations, echoes the unmistakable signs of a different type of dependency, one that even the palace's press officers have struggled to contain. Prince Andrew, Duke of York, born in 1960, has spent much of his adult life embodying a moniker that many have come to know him by, the Party Prince. This tag, once a source of distinction marking him as vivacious and appealing compared to his more reserved royal kin, has evolved over time, becoming a sharper critique. Amid the extravagant vacations, lavish indulgences, and controversial associations, a troubling narrative began to take shape, one of potential compulsive behaviors hinting at a deeper, unresolved dependency on gambling and sex. While the royal family has remained tight-lipped about Andrew's private life, he has consistently refuted serious allegations that have arisen in recent years. Yet, addiction often lurks in the shadows, hidden from view by the wealth and status that mask uncomfortable truths. Andrew's gambling penchant has been the subject of scrutiny from journalists and insiders alike, painting a vivid picture of a man who frequented elite casinos across London, Monte Carlo, and the Gulf, merging duty with pleasure. His behavior at the tables triggered questions about his finances, especially given his lack of substantial private wealth. In 2022, revelations surfaced regarding substantial financial gifts from affluent acquaintances and foreign dignitaries, hinting at a lifestyle sustained by dubious backers. More troubling are the persistent suggestions that Andrew's compulsive tendencies extend to his personal relationships, particularly involving the notorious Jeffrey Epstein. Despite Prince Andrew's firm denials, the sheer accumulation of evidence, photos, travel records, and witness accounts illustrates a social life shadowed by secrecy. Compulsion, while not synonymous with criminality, often mirrors patterns associated with addiction, particularly when combined with privilege and a lack of repercussions. For decades, Andrew has navigated a world of unbridled access, fostering an environment ripe for dependency without the need for official acknowledgement. As the years have progressed, the palace's response has been one of withdrawal, with Andrew divested of his military honours and royal roles, retreating from public view devoid of any apologies or admissions. All his inner battles, be they psychological or behavioural, remain hidden behind palace walls and legal complications. Though addiction is indiscriminate, fostering itself in silence and secrecy, it can ripple through generations. In today's age of supposed transparency, the reigning monarch too has straddled the fine line between personal restraint and excessive indulgence, his early behaviour sparking quiet unease, and yet somehow managing to remain polished enough to evade scrutiny. Before ascending to the throne as King Charles III in 1948, he was known as Prince Charles, famously holding the title of the longest-serving heir apparent in British history. This was a man shaped by a unique combination of patience, adherence to protocol, and an intriguing mixture of restraint and eccentricity. Tales abound of a royal who conversed with his beloved plants, whispered to ministers in private meetings, and allegedly travelled with a personalised toilet seat, a rumour that seems only to deepen the intrigue around his character. He stood as a bastion of tradition, yet had surprising quirks, often appearing calm and poised, shadowed by the immense pressure of royal expectations that pulled at him privately. Despite the stable exterior, Charles bore his own burdens in silence, navigating a complicated relationship with substances that, while never leading to public scandal, echoed a long-standing royal narrative, the struggle to manage discomfort through dependency. During his early adulthood, whispers circulated about his use of herbal sedatives and strong spirits, like Scotch whisky, seeking solace from the demanding life of royalty. While his relatives might have indulged in dramatic excesses, Charles's reliance on certain coping mechanisms was more subdued, documented by biographers and those close to him as a notable phase of his life in the 1970s and early 1980s. During this time, he embodied a duality, a public figure groomed for monarchy, dressed immaculately, and engaged in formalities, contrasted sharply with his private self, grappling with feelings of isolation and uncertainty. His correspondence from this tumultuous period revealed a young man feeling overwhelmed, struggling against the confines of palace life, and weary of press scrutiny. Close sources divulged that he often resorted to herbal tinctures from homeopathic practitioners to combat sleeplessness and anxiety, substances that, while natural, could still exert a powerful influence on his state of mind. Perhaps even more concerning was his burgeoning appreciation for alcohol during this era. Though generally not labelled a heavy drinker, former aides remarked on his preference for high-proof scotch, consumed not in the company of others, but in the solitude of his own space. A long-serving butler described a meticulous evening routine, where his singular drink was consistently served alone, never excessive, but indicative of deeper patterns. Within the carefully monitored environment of the palace, these behaviors were regarded as tolerable, perhaps even commendable amid the surrounding tumult. However, a subtle campaign was underway to shift these habits, with advisors encouraging a healthier lifestyle, greater social interaction, more activities to fill his time, less opportunity for solitary introspection. These efforts, though not grand in scale, were thoughtfully orchestrated. As time passed, Charles navigated into his public role with newfound stability, championing significant causes like climate change, organic farming, and architecture, while gradually reshaping his personal life. Yet, the early experiences defined by silent struggles and late-night reflections lingered, reflecting an innate vulnerability. Now as king, he exudes discipline and poise, but once reached for small comforts amidst the extraordinary expectations placed upon him. Not marked by excess or scandal, his story resonates with the relatable journey of carrying burdens not meant to be borne alone. In this, perhaps lies the ultimate enigma. Beneath the weight of tradition, the British monarchy remains a profoundly human institution, imperfect, shrouded in secrecy, and quietly entwined with the very patterns it aims to transcend.